Let me begin with a question. Did you see the link between the first reading and the gospel? You probably did. In that first reading, that prophet with the unusual name Zechariah sounded almost giddy when he said, "Rejoice heartily, O daughter Zion. Shout for joy, O daughter Jerusalem." But really, he didn't have much to be happy about, because in his day, Alexander the Great had destroyed Jerusalem and had wiped out the kingly line of David about 330 years before Jesus. Yet Zechariah promised, "See, your king shall come to you, not in a war chariot, but meek and riding on an ass." We see that prophecy fulfilled when Jesus entered Jerusalem on what we celebrate as Palm Sunday. But it's also fulfilled in the words of Jesus in today's gospel. "Take my yoke upon me, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden light." Those are some of the most tender words you'll ever hear Jesus say in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. But do they sound like a person who, like Zechariah in that first reading, was facing failure? The truth is, they were. At that time, Jesus was encountering a great deal of opposition to himself and to his message. You remember even John the Baptist in prison sent disciples asking him, "Are you the one that's to come that we've been waiting and hoping for, or should we look for somebody else?" The Pharisees and the scribes were constantly contradicting him. He was getting so frustrated that he said to his second hometown, Capernaum, that it would find a lower place in hell than Sodom and Gomorrah, because despite all his preaching and their challenging, nothing seemed to have changed at all. That's when he had to look around and say, "Is anybody listening?" And when he also realized, yes, there were people listening. He thanked God for that. Not the feisty intellectual leaders or those who had the wise and the learned, as he called them, but those who never went to religious education 101, who never studied the law in order to find its loopholes. They were the ordinary people who were open and eager to welcome God into their lives and into their hearts, and willing to have it make a difference in them. So Jesus welcomed them and invited them to come to him, to have those burdens of the law that the Pharisees and scribes placed so heavily on their shoulders. They have these burdens lifted from their consciences. He invited them and you and me to take up his yoke, the kind of yoke that were put on oxen to control them when they plowed the fields. But a yoke that would be sweet and easy, because Jesus was inviting them and us into his own heart, a heart that was meek and humble, so that we could learn from him. But he says this will only be understood by little ones. Do you think that we're little enough to understand them today? Like this person. A few years ago, a gunman killed 32 people on the Virginia Tech campus, and Barbara Laporte's son, Matt, was one of those who was murdered. He was in his sophomore year when a deranged student stormed into his French class, firing an automatic weapon. After Matt's death, Barbara said that her family walked around as if in a fog for weeks, and then they realized they could either mourn in isolation or accept comfort and find relief. She told her story to an Orange County Catholic Church meeting some time ago. She doesn't pretend to understand why her son died. "I'm letting the Lord lead me," she said. But everywhere, she said, she sees the Lord send signs of comfort. like the Virginia State Trooper who told her that he found Matt's lifeless body on the classroom floor. In all that chaos and horror, he said, Matt had a serene look of peace on his face. Or the letter from the family of a girl who survived because Matt helped barricade at the door of the classroom long enough for her to hide and be safe. And she saw a sign in the sunbeam that broke through the clouds one afternoon and settled for a moment on the couch beside her when she was reading this passage from the Gospel of John. Greater love no one has than this, to lay down his life for his friends. It was the only sunlight that day. Barbara said she never felt anger over her son's death. God was there for me. If I was full of anger, I wouldn't have been able to receive healing, she said. I came to the realization that forgiveness, love, and mercy help to lift the burden of the cross, like Jesus said. Barbara Laporte was a little one. When I go back to Wisconsin, as I'll be doing this last week, I always meet with a group of fathers who have lost a child. And I have 3 cousins among that group. I hear wonderful stories from them about the little signs in their life, signs from God, reassuring them and comforting them in their loss. Maybe some of you have stories like that yourself. In today's scriptures, we heard Jesus telling about his care for us and his promise of being there for us when we have to carry that burden. In the Eucharist, he offers himself again to God, and he offers himself to us. And then in communion, after we've recalled his passion, death, and resurrection, he comes to us so intimately as we respond to his invitation, come to me, all you who labor and are burdened. But he doesn't have to say a word. Neither do we. We just take Jesus Christ into our hearts. That's all we need to do. And who knows, maybe despite the heavy burdens some of us are carrying today in church, Jesus may praise the Father again for little people like you and maybe like me. Amen.